introduce our speaker for the next segment, which is on unanswered questions. And this segment, I think, in many ways is going to expand on our theme for the day. So, Dr. Pavan Mamidi is the director at the Center for Social and Behaviour Change. He led the creation of India's first nudge unit, which was the Behavioral Insights Unit at Niti Aayog. And he's also, of course, been instrumental in the creation of behavioral insights units for governments in Uttar Pradesh as well as Bihar. He holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford and a master's in law from Harvard Law School. He's been a visiting professor at LSC and has taught at IIM Ahmedabad, Bangalore, and the University of Michigan Law School. Over to you, Pavan. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I come today with much gratitude, first of all, to my own team. Gopi, Asta, Pallavi, Anandita, Bidisha, they worked tirelessly to put this event together. When we were conceptualizing this event, one of the things that we decided to do was think about not only the opportunities that AI presents to our society, but also to think a little in terms of the bigger questions that it raises, both at a philosophical level, at an ethical level, at a policy level. And it's not just opportunities, but there are also concerns that we need to be aware of. And we have started thinking quite deeply about this. And today I'm really, really fortunate that we're joined by Subhashish and Kailash, who are going to sort of delve into these questions, possibly in a sort of a deeper manner than I will at this stage. But what I do wish to do is kind of talk about some of the intellectual nuances of thinking about AI and how AI begins to question our sense of identity and who we are as human beings. And to that end, I'm going to start off with a curious little video that comes from the world of evolutionary biology and evolutionary behavior. And this is a video that I showed the last time. And there are some nuances in this video which I did not have an opportunity to discuss in my last talk that I gave here last year. And there are two components to this video. Let's start with that video, and then we will get into the ethical aspects of AI, about human behavior, and so on. May I? So it's a 2-minute video. It's a fascinating video, and let me give you a little bit of context. This is a video of two monkeys, and Dr. Sarah Brosnan. Don't play it yet.
So final experiment that I want to
pause it. Yeah. So this is a video which comprises of two monkeys. And these two monkeys are fed, they have to perform a task. They have to give a stone. Now, you might be wondering, why are we even dealing with monkeys? Monkeys tell us a little more about ourselves than we can tell each other, right? These monkeys have to perform a task. Each one has to give a stone, right? And when they give a stone, they're given a little reward, the reward being a piece of food. In the initial stages, when they're given cucumber, they're perfectly all right. But an inequity is introduced into this setup. One of the monkeys is given a grape and the other is given cucumber, and you will see the reaction of these two. Now, there are two reactions. I want you to pay attention to both the reactions. The second reaction is slightly more subtle and nuanced, which we will talk about, right? And this is a classical experiment, right? So please play the video.
mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And There's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So we can get back to the presentation. Yeah. So this little video of the two monkeys is pretty instructive. On one hand, the clear message that comes across, that comes out of this, is a very deep-rooted, almost evolutionary aversion to inequity. I think we are all very familiar with it. I mean, political philosophers have talked about it and so on. When you create unequal circumstances, it leads to a sense of protest and so on. And this is in classical sort of behavioral economics speak, this is a systems one reaction. It's an emotional reaction to being treated unequally, right? That's the sort of the first insight that we can draw from the behavior of this. Daniel Kahneman has talked about it, inequity aversion. We run behavioral experiments to demonstrate this. There's something called a public goods game. There's something called a dictator game, and so on. We run these games and we can demonstrate that this is a behavior that is exhibited by humans across the world, right? But there is a second observation that we can make from this video that often gets missed. Does anybody have a clue as to what that is? And it's fascinating. And this is not systems one. This is a systems two reaction that you also notice. Any observers here? No, the other monkey is also pretty aware of what is happening here. Well, I mean, the fact that the other monkey accepts a grape unscrupulously is a thing to be thought about, but it's the reaction of the first monkey that bears some attention. Any other thoughts? No. There is a really subtle point that it makes, and it tells us something profound about human behavior, right? That's it. This impulse to test the rock is a systems two reaction, by the way. Why is it testing the rock? It's looking for an explanation. So inequity aversion, which is primarily an emotional reaction, leads to a systems two demand for an explanation. And so in some sense, we are moving from a systems one to a systems two kind of, so a demand within the systems one is generating a demand within a systems two. See, we ordinarily think that the demand for explanations, and here by explanations, one means a causal explanation. It's not even a correlational explanation. And there's a difference between causal explanations and correlational explanations. A causal explanation is one which looks for ceteris paribus. You're controlling for everything for you to be able to draw a causal relationship between that which has been caused and that which has been produced as an effect, right? And that's why we run randomized control experiments. So running an experiment is not merely an artifice of human imagination, but it's a much more primordial evolutionary tendency that we have to be able to look for explanations. So if we are running experiments, we run experiments primarily because we are driven by almost an instinct to look for causal explanations, right? And that is fascinating. So typically, we arrive at the demand for causal explanations for pragmatic purposes. Why we want to make a better fan, we want to make a better airplane, or we want to do technology better. But here is an example of an emotional demand translating itself into a systems to demand. And that I think is a fascinating one. So, and this is something that we should not ignore. So notice the transition from an emotional to an epistemic demand, and I call this an epistemic demand, is unusual and unexpected. Notice we normally expect them to occupy different cognitive spaces. But notice we are more familiar when the emotional and the epistemic diverge. We often think that the epistemic is at odds with the emotional, not necessarily the case. For instance, confirmation bias, where we reject true facts when they collide with antecedent beliefs. One of the, they talked about fake news and so on. Confirmation bias afflicts us. We are willing to only accept facts when they either conform to our prior beliefs or reject facts when they do not conform to our prior beliefs. And this is a behavioral bias that has been studied quite extensively by behavioral economists. And notice that the demand for the causal may also come from the heart, from the depths of our emotional commitments to fairness. And that is a very interesting point that needs to be talked about. So, in the pursuit of expediency, we cannot neglect the unmet demand for fairness. That's the starting premise of what I wanted to, at the very outset, talk about, right? The second sort of thought that I have relates to this business of symmetry between prediction and explanation. And I think this is a symmetry that has been assumed by philosophers and that actually uh, needs some clarification. We imagine that prediction is a form of explanation into the future, whereas an explanation is a prediction into the past. And they assume that there is a symmetry between the two. The language of prediction and the language of explanation are very different, right? And this is where the symmetry breaks down. This is something that Carl Hempel has talked about, a bunch of philosophers of science have talked about, and we need to pay attention to this particular difference because it connects with what we know about AI. AI is fundamentally about prediction, and AI is limited in its ability to explain. The reason being, AI's capacity to randomize and arrive at explanations is very restricted. And that is, there's this philosopher called Judea Pearl who's explored this very, very deeply. He's written this book called Why, he's written a book called Causality, and so on. Incidentally, he's also the father of Daniel Pearl, the journalist who was beheaded by terrorists and so on. So Judea Pearl has been talking about the ability of AI to draw causal inferences. And we have come to a point where we believe that AI has limited causal explanatory power. I mean, you have creative computer scientists who believe that by producing synthetic data and so on, we can arrive at causal inferences through AI, but that's kind of uh, dodgy in some sense. I mean, because synthetic data is derived from the same original data set and its ability to actually randomize. I mean, its ability to incorporate the principle of randomization is pretty. Now, we don't need to go into the technical details, but suffice it to say that AI's ability to arrive at causal explanations is somewhat restricted. And one image that really sort of captures this is the following. They use the example of the flagpole. The flagpole stands in the it casts a shadow on the ground because it's a sunny day. You can predict the length of the shadow on the basis of antecedent facts in terms of the length of the flagpole, the height of the sun, or whatever. But you can't explain the height of the flagpole on the basis of the length of the shadow. There are exogenous variables that determine the length of the flagpole. And this, in some sense, illustrates the breakdown of the asymmetry, breaks down the asymmetry between prediction and explanation. And that's something that we need to think about. Which brings me to my next point. So AI is limited in its ability to explain and in its ability to form causal or give us a purchase of causal relationships. So, but why do explanations matter for us? Explanations matter for us because we want to use AI in decision making, right? You're thinking about AI judges, you're thinking about AI policymakers, etc., etc. Now, without potential explanations, where AI becomes this black box which arrives at decisions, how do you trust the decisions that emerge from AI? And this is an unanswered question. This is something that we need to really be worried about, right? Now, you might say, every time a person who gets into an airplane, do they really need to know the causal basis of how airplanes fly for them to trust getting into an airplane? Not necessarily the case. However, the event of you getting onto an airplane, a physical system, is very different from you relegating the responsibility of decision making where it concerns matters of justice or where it concerns matters of fairness to AI. And that's something that you need to think about. So explainability of AI is still a nebulous and an uncertain terrain. And how do we even get into that space to start thinking about outsourcing decision making to AI in whether it concerns justice or fairness in society is something that we need to think about. I want to sort of also get into a second set of ideas, and that relates to privacy. Let me start off with this rather disturbing picture of a tailor in Bangladesh, right? The person is stitching clothes, but the person also has a GoPro camera attached to his head. He's essentially training a robot which will eventually take his job, right? Now, you might think that AI is going to stop only at codifiable knowledge, right? I mean, knowledge that is repetitive, that which can be spoken about, and so on and so forth. And that it will not challenge our ability to use tacit skills. And tacit, the tacit dimension has been talked about by Michael Polanyi, the philosopher, again, who talks about a form of knowledge which cannot be codified. And you might think that AI will not get into that space, but here is an image of an attempt by a corporation or whoever who's actually trying to capture tacit skills and then be able to relegate the job to AI, right, or to a robot. Now, I'm not against a machine or a system taking over the job of a person as such. If it produces more efficient outcomes, that is fine. But here is a thought for you to think about. Is the transaction that happens at that personal level where the tailor is giving away the skills that will actually, in a tragic manner, lead to his job loss, is it a fair transaction, right? That's an important question. I don't want you to stop the training of the robot itself. If it reduces human burden, that is fine, that is great. But the question is there a just compensation for the tailor who's going to lose his or her job? And that is a pertinent question to ask. Now, you might liken this whole business of aggregation of data to the aggregation of land. I come from a legal background and I've studied aggregation of land and so on. India's population has increased dramatically, whereas the land has remained finite and land has become fragmented. And so they basically exercise eminent domain to aggregate small holdings of land to be able to create economies of scale and so on. But a great solution proposed by economists has been that you try to compensate the individuals who are dispossessed of their land with future cash flows from the project that you undertake. So the narrative of privacy has restricted itself to a mere conversation about the concealment of information or revelation of information. We ran this wonderful experiment, sample size of 10,000, 5,000 in India and 5,000 in Kenya. And what we discovered there was that people actually have a preference for sharing of information, because when they share information, it's a bit of a transaction that leads to gaining access to further amounts of information. So they're willing to give information about themselves so that they get something in exchange, which is fair. Now, privacy has often been talked about in terms of the concealment of information, but there is an earlier and a richer jurisprudence of privacy which tells us privacy is not really about the concealment or the revelation of information, but privacy is really about personhood. It's about the protection of your personhood, right? So if in fact the revelation of information is not supportive of your personhood, then privacy stops being about the concealment of information. So, I mean, take for instance this entire case called Roe versus Wade, which deals with abortion, the right to abortion. That was argued on grounds of privacy. It was about personhood of women's bodies and so on. And that led to a richer jurisprudence of privacy. So, privacy really is not necessary. It does not necessarily mean that you conceal information. If in the furtherance of your personhood you want to reveal information, then so be it. Privacy then becomes revealing information. So we cannot tie privacy down to this very narrow GDPR conception of privacy as, oh, you got to try and protect all information. That's not really what it means. But here is where we come to an important point, and that is, how do we then shift this whole discussion of privacy to a point where we are able to say people are revealing their information, and they probably do because there are aggregate benefits, because the machine is going to take over the burden of human beings and so on. But is there a way that we can give them future cash flows for the losses that they suffer at an aggregate level? The benefits of AI are at a statistical aggregate, but the losses are also at an aggregate level. So who compensates for the delta that happens at an aggregate level? And that is, so we need to shift our discussion about privacy from meaning very petty private transactional affairs where I'm either willing to give information or conceal information, to one where we talk about what are the societal what are the societal consequences of parting with information at an aggregate level. Is there a way that we can give them a share in the future cash flows? Can we reconcile the efficiency of technological innovation with justice? And that's an important thing to bear in mind. I want to kind of end my conversation with you guys in talking about two low-tech uh, things, right? I mean, we talk about AI, we talk about chips and NVIDIA and so on. Let's move briefly into a study that we undertook at IIM Ahmedabad, right? I mean, this is about the adoption of the mop, right? I mean, we are used to households employing typically women. There's a gender angle to how you look at this. And, there's evidence to suggest that a mop is almost 8 times more efficient than a woman having to bend on her haunches and clean the floor, right? And yet there is resistance to the adoption of the mop. Can you even guess why? I mean, we looked at it from the supply side and we looked at it from the demand side as well. The supply side, the households are reluctant to adopt the mop because they feel that the person has not worked sufficiently if you adopt the mop. The person is going to stand and use the mop, whereas if the person is crouched, it maintains the equilibrium of status, it maintains the equilibrium of inequality. The equilibrium of inequality is a term coined by the Brazilian thinker Paulo Freire. Supply side, they're not, households are reluctant to adopt the mop. Now, that's interesting. I mean, that's not so hard to uh, imagine, right? It's kind of insidious and it's kind of disturbing. Even though there's a piece of technology that's more efficient and much easier for people to do a particular task they're unwilling to. So the best of inventions don't mean a thing if they're not absorbed by society. But look at the demand side, and that also throws some really, really interesting perspectives. So we went and talked to a few women who work in these households who mop the floors, and we asked them. They were very reluctant to adopt the mop as well, even though it made their jobs much easier. Guess why? When a woman enters a stranger's house, she has to stand. And when she stands, she becomes far more vulnerable to a potential sexual predator and therefore showed reluctance to adopt the mop. So, this equilibrium, this strange equilibrium between the supply side and the demand side, thwarted the adoption of the humble mop. Now, if we were to go into a supermarket, you find a lot of janitors using mops. And we kind of wondered why. Why is it that in households that you don't have mops being adopted, whereas in supermarkets and in corporations, you find these people quite willing to adopt the mop? And we discovered that a simple behavioral intervention allowed for the adoption of the mop, which is the people who worked basically wore a certain set of clothes which dissolved their identities as workers or as lower people or as inferior people. The janitor, the janitorial dresses that they wore dissolved their identities as women or as whichever caste they came from, and that allowed them to basically pick up the mop and use it and adopt the technology much better. This is my first example of how behavior and how social norms impact the adoption of technology. My second example comes from a piece of work that we started doing about 25 years ago, Sharon and I, in northern Karnataka. And this started off with a puzzle as to why the bullock cart has struck an equilibrium in our society. A bullock cart is predominantly made up of wood, save for a couple of metal pieces which serve as its axle, right? It's clunky, it's heavy, it's inefficient. And we wondered why. And we did a lot of qualitative work. We did a bunch of interviews there, and we discovered that, uh, you know, it's the carpenters who make the bullock carts, and that the carpenters are reluctant to talk to the smiths. The smiths, they 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 make the metal objects, and the carpenters are disallowed from learning the skills of the smiths. And the smiths are not allowed to learn the skills of the carpenters. In other words, if you were to conceive innovation as a co-integration of materials, in order to bring those materials together, you need a co-integration of communities. You need to reduce the transaction costs of the interaction between the two communities, right? And this is a stunning insight into why innovation may have been retarded for centuries. It's the caste system, right? Think about it. How social norms begin to impact the creation of new objects which might require multiple types of materials. I'll give you a stunning fact. If you were to enter into an Indian handicraft store, you will find the most stunning objects, made with the greatest amount of precision, painstakingly done, and so on. But how many of you have noticed that each of those materials is typically unimaterial, right? Have you noticed that? Now, that's interesting, isn't it? It's fascinating. Why? Because of these informal social norms of intellectual property, which prevent castes from learning each other's skills. So, how do we overcome that? That's an important question to bear in mind. So, now, as a counterpoint, I started studying Edison's lab, right? Menlo Park. They had glass blowers, they had carpenters, they had smiths. In the West, too, you have different materials divided up by different communities. But what Edison did was very interesting. He mediated the disputes between these people, right? He basically got the glass blowers, the smiths, the carpenters all work together. They had conflicts between each other. So for the cross-fertilization of many of the inventions that came out of Edison's lab, mediation of social disputes became an important criteria. So here, we are led to this very stunning fact, and that is mediation is connected with innovation. And innovation is not merely a technical accomplishment. A technical accomplishment is an invention, and having inventions is not enough. I'll finish. Right? For an invention to become an innovation, you need to go on a behavioral journey of assimilation by society. And unless you're willing to make that journey, you're not going to get innovations in society. So let's not get confused between being inventive and being innovative, right? So these are the questions that I had, the unanswered questions, which, which we are privileged to have two distinguished guests join us. I'd like us to address some of these questions. How do we trust technology without explanations? How do we bridge the gap between being inventive and coming to a point where we have innovation in society, right? And who pays for the aggregate displacement of labor in society? These are the big burning questions that AI brings into our society, and we need to be worried about these questions. It's not sufficient to be excited and exuberant about the coolness. We have this coolness bias. It's not just about being cool, it's also about being responsible. Thank you.